What if the Anunnaki were never meant to be understood as individuals? What if they were not characters with personal desires, not beings who loved or envied or grieved, but something more abstract, something closer to structure itself? The oldest Sumerian texts do not describe their faces. They do not tell their stories in the way we expect stories to be told. They rarely give them voices that speak with personal inflection or individual purpose. Instead, they appear together. They decide together. They rule as one. Tonight we explore a quieter idea, one that asks us to set aside modern expectations about what gods must be. We propose that the Anunnaki were not gods with personalities, not figures who could be painted or imagined in human terms, but an institution of order, a system given divine weight, a collective authority that existed not to be known, but to be acknowledged. This is not a claim of absolute certainty. It is an interpretation, a reading of silence as much as text, a way of listening to what the ancient scribes wrote and noticing what they did not write. Because sometimes, what is absent tells us more than what remains. If this approach feels right to you, if you value patience over spectacle and curiosity over certainty, consider staying with us. Subscribe if this kind of exploration resonates, not because we ask you to, but because you want to walk this path with others who listen carefully. And if you're willing, leave a comment. Tell us where you are in the world right now, what time it is there, whether the night is quiet or restless. We are listening too. In the beginning, there was no distinction between sky and earth, no boundary between water and land, no word for God or human because neither had yet taken form. The Sumerian cosmology begins in a state we might call undifferentiated vastness. Not chaos exactly, though the word is sometimes used, not violence, just an endless expanse of water, dark and still, holding all potential, within itself but expressing none of it. The texts call this state Namu in some cases, the primordial sea, not a goddess in the sense we might imagine today, with hands and eyes and will, but a presence, a condition, the matrix from which separation would eventually emerge. This water was not empty, it was full of everything that had not yet become distinct. Sky was there, but not above. Earth was there, but not below. The gods existed in potential, but not in form. Time moved differently, or perhaps did not move at all. There was no day, no night, no labour, no rest. Just the deep hum of existence waiting to unfold. And in this waiting, something began. Not suddenly, not with thunder or command, but slowly, inevitably, the way a thought becomes clear after long silence. The text describes separation. Sky and earth pulled apart, Anunnaki, heaven and ground. This separation was not violent in the early sources. It was necessary, foundational. Without it, nothing could exist in the way existence requires. No space for breath, no room for movement, no place for anything to stand or grow or die. The separation created distance, and distance created possibility. But it also created something else. It created the need for order, because once things are separated, they must be kept separate. Once distinctions exist, they must be maintained. And this maintenance, this endless work of keeping the world in its proper form, required authority. The authority that emerged was collective. The texts name it the Anunnaki. They appear not as individuals with origin stories, not as characters born from other characters in a genealogy we can trace, but as a presence already established, already complete, already functioning. They are described as the great gods, the gods of the assembly, the ones who decree fate. But when we look closely at how they are presented, we notice something striking. They do not act alone. They do not speak in individual voices with personal concerns. They decide as a group. They judge as a council. They maintain order not through personal intervention, but through collective decree. This is unusual. In most mythologies we are familiar with, gods have personalities. Zeus has his thunderbolts and his affairs. Odin has his eye and his ravens. Isis searches for her lost husband. These gods act, they desire, they scheme and love and betray. But the Anunnaki, in the earliest layers of Sumerian thought, do not do these things. They exist in a different mode entirely. They are described not by what they want, but by what they maintain. Not by who they are, but by what they ensure continues. We expect gods to be individuals because that is how later mythology taught us to think about divinity. Greek gods had distinct personalities, flaws, and motivations. Norse gods had individual sagas. Egyptian gods had elaborate stories of conflict and resolution. These narratives give us something to hold on to. They make the divine comprehensible through the lens of human emotion and human drama. But the Anunnaki resist this comprehension. They remain abstract, distant, unified in a way that feels almost bureaucratic. And perhaps that is precisely the point. When the Anunnaki appear in Sumerian texts, they appear as a collective presence. The term itself is plural, not Anunnaki as a single being, but Anunnaki as a group, a council, an assembly of divine authority. They are mentioned in contexts of judgment, in moments when fate is determined, when cosmic order is established or reaffirmed. They do not star in adventure narratives. They do not have origin myths that detail their births or their childhoods or their rise to power. They simply are. They have always been, and their function is to decree. In the text known as the Descent of Inanna, when Inanna dies in the underworld, it is the Anunnaki who sit in judgment. But they are not named individually. They do not speak with distinct voices. They are present as a collective body, rendering a collective verdict. They decide together. They act as one. This pattern repeats across different texts. Whenever the Anunnaki appear, they appear in this mode, as a unified authority, as a system of judgment rather than a collection of judges. Consider what is missing from the textual record. There are no myths about the Anunnaki's personal relationships, no stories of one Anunnaki falling in love with another, no tales of rivalry or jealousy or betrayal within their ranks. No individual Anunnaki goes on a quest. No individual Anunnaki rebels or mourns or celebrates. They do not have children who become heroes. They do not interact with humans as mentors or adversaries. They exist above and apart from the narrative machinery that drives most mythology. And this absence is not accidental. It is not a gap in the record that time has eroded. It is a feature of how they were conceived from the beginning. Other Sumerian gods are vivid. Inanna is passionate, dangerous, complex. Enki is clever, resourceful, deeply involved in human affairs. Enlil is powerful, decisive, sometimes wrathful. These gods have personalities we can describe. They make choices that reflect individual character, but the Anunnaki do not. They remain abstract in a way that suggests abstraction was the point. They were not meant to be imagined as faces or forms. They were meant to represent something else entirely. What they represent, we might argue, is institutional authority, not the authority of a single ruler, but the authority of a system. The kind of power that does not depend on personality or personal presence. The kind of order that transcends any individual who might enforce it. Think of how institutions function in human society. A court of law does not depend on the personality of any single judge to be legitimate. Its authority comes from the system itself, from the continuity of legal tradition, from the collective weight of precedent and structure. Individual judges come and go, but the institution remains, the law remains. And the Anunnaki function in precisely this way. They assign roles, they establish cosmic law, they maintain the structure of reality itself. This is not the behavior of individuals pursuing personal agendas. This is the behavior of an institution maintaining order. When the texts say the Anunnaki decree fate, they are describing a process, not a conversation. They are describing the pronouncement of cosmic law, the establishment of what must be, without reference to why any individual god might want it that way. The decree stands because the Anunnaki have decreed it. The authority is circular and complete. It needs no further justification. This institutional quality helps explain why the Anunnaki were considered supreme despite their lack of individual presence in myth. Power does not require personality to function. In fact, some forms of power function more effectively without it. Personal gods can be appealed to. They can be swayed by prayer or sacrifice or clever argument. But institutional authority is different. It is impersonal by design. It does not listen to individual pleas because it operates according to principles that transcend individual cases. The Anunnaki's power lies not in their ability to act, but in their permanence. They embody the kind of order that simply is, regardless of circumstance or petition. If the Anunnaki were not individuals, if they were never meant to be understood as distinct beings with personal identities, why were they considered supreme? Why were they invoked with such weight and reverence? The answer may lie in what they represented to the Sumerian mind. They represented law as divinity itself, not laws handed down by gods, but law as the fundamental structure of existence. The decrees of the Anunnaki were not decisions made after deliberation. They were the articulation of cosmic truth. They were the way things are and must continue to be. In many cultures, law becomes sacred when it is understood as eternal and unchanging. When legal authority is rooted in divine will, it gains a weight that human authority alone cannot provide. But the Anunnaki take this concept further. They are not gods who decide what the law should be. They are the law. Their existence and their function are identical. To invoke the Anunnaki is to invoke the principle of order itself, the idea that reality has structure, and that structure must be maintained. This is why they do not need faces. This is why they do not need stories. Faces and stories are for beings who act within the world. But the Anunnaki are the framework within which all action occurs. This made profound sense to the Sumerians. Early civilization in Mesopotamia depended utterly on structure. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded regularly, and survival required predicting those floods, channeling them, managing them. Agriculture required coordination of labor across large populations. Irrigation systems had to be built and maintained. Cities required hierarchy, administration, record-keeping. The Sumerian world was a world of imposed order carved out from chaos through collective effort. And in such a world, the divine force that maintains order would naturally be conceived in institutional terms. The Anunnaki reflect the lived reality of Sumerian society. They are not gods who intervene dramatically in individual lives. They are gods who ensure that the structure holds, that the seasons continue, that the cosmic hierarchy remains stable, that the great patterns persist. In a world where survival depends on these patterns, where a single failure of the irrigation system or a single breach in the social order could mean disaster, the gods who guarantee continuity would be the most important gods of all. Not the most exciting, not the most personally engaging, but the most fundamentally necessary. Consider the nature of institutional memory. Individuals fade, personal names are forgotten. The specific faces of the dead blur and disappear, but systems endure. Legal codes outlast the kings who proclaimed them. Religious institutions outlast their founders. Universities outlast their professors. The structure persists even as the people within it change completely. And perhaps this is what the Anunnaki were always meant to represent. Not the temporary personal individual gods who might love or fight or die, but the eternal structure that remains regardless of what else changes. The texts preserve the Anunnaki precisely because they are structural. They do not tell personal stories that become dated or contradictory. They do not have adventures that clash with other traditions. They simply decree, they judge, they maintain. And this function, unlike personal narrative, can be invoked again and again without alteration. The Anunnaki of one text are the same as the Anunnaki of another, not because their character remains consistent, but because they have no character to vary. They are pure function. As Mesopotamian civilization evolved, as mythology grew more complex and more narratively rich, other gods became more prominent. Personal gods with vivid personalities and dramatic stories took center stage in later texts. Marduk rises to supremacy in Babylon with a detailed myth of his victory over Tiamat. Ishtar's stories become elaborate and emotionally complex. The mythology becomes more like what we expect mythology to be, full of drama and conflict and resolution. But this evolution does not erase the earlier layer, it builds on top of it. And if we dig down through those layers, if we look at the oldest stratum of Sumerian thought, we find the Anunnaki still there, still abstract, still institutional. Later traditions reinterpreted them. In some texts, individual Anunnaki are named. Specific gods are identified as belonging to the Anunnaki group. This process of individualization reflects the changing needs of later mythology. As gods became more personal in general, the Anunnaki had to be brought into that framework. They had to be given names and specific roles to fit into the genealogies and hierarchies that later theologians constructed. But this reinterpretation should not obscure the earlier reality. The Anunnaki began as something else. They began as collective authority without individual identity. The transformation from institutional abstraction to individual deity is a common pattern in religious history. Abstract concepts become personified. Legal principles become divine judges. Cosmic forces become gods with names and stories. This happens because humans find it easier to relate to personalities than to abstractions. We are social beings. We understand other minds. We struggle to grasp pure structure. And so, over time, structure gets a face. Order gets a name. The institution becomes a person. But the earliest texts resist this. They preserve a moment when the divine could still be understood as impersonal, as institutional, as structure itself. We should read this silence carefully. The absence of personal detail about the Anunnaki is not a flaw in the textual tradition. It is not evidence that stories were lost, or that we simply do not have enough information. The silence is intentional. It is meaningful. The Anunnaki were never meant to be imagined in the way we imagine other gods. They were never meant to have stories that could be told around fires or painted on temple walls. They were meant to be accepted, acknowledged, invoked as the authority that underpins everything else. This kind of divinity requires a different relationship from worshippers. You do not pray to an institution for personal favour. You do not offer sacrifice to change its mind. You acknowledge its authority. You align yourself with its decrees. You recognise that its order is the foundation of your existence, and that disrupting that order would be catastrophic. The Anunnaki do not need to be loved. They need to be respected. And respect in this context means accepting the structure they represent as inevitable and necessary. There is something eerie about this conception of divinity, something that feels cold to modern sensibilities. We are accustomed to gods who care about us, even if that care is harsh or demanding. We want gods who notice us, who respond to our prayers, who intervene in our lives for better or worse. But the Anunnaki do not care in that sense. Not because they are cruel, but because caring is not their function. They maintain order, they decree fate, they ensure continuity, and these activities do not require or involve personal attention to individual human concerns. Yet perhaps there is comfort in this impersonality. Personal gods can be capricious, they can be offended or pleased by small things, they can change their minds, they can be manipulated through proper ritual or angered by inadvertent transgression. But institutional authority is stable. It does not play favourites. It does not shift with mood or circumstance. It simply is. And in a world of profound uncertainty, where floods come without warning, and harvests fail, and cities fall, the existence of a divine order that remains constant might offer a kind of reassurance that personal gods cannot provide. The Anunnaki represent the idea that beneath all change, beneath all chaos, there is structure, there is law, there is an order that holds even when everything else collapses. This is not a warm comfort. It is not a comfort that makes you feel seen or loved. But it is the comfort of knowing that reality itself has rules, that those rules will continue, that the world will not simply dissolve into randomness. And perhaps for the ancient Sumerians, living at the edge of what civilization could sustain, this cold comfort was profound. When we look at Sumerian texts about labour and burden, we see the Anunnaki involved in the distribution of cosmic duty. When the gods themselves complain about the work of maintaining the world, when they grow weary of digging canals and building structures, it is the Anunnaki who are involved in the decision to create humans to bear that burden. But even here, they are not portrayed as individuals making a personal choice. They are portrayed as an authority decreeing a solution to a structural problem. The decision is presented as inevitable, as the logical conclusion of the cosmic order they maintain. This is crucial to understanding how the Anunnaki function. They do not intervene in the world the way personal gods intervene. They do not appear to individuals with messages or demands. They do not become angry at specific people or favour specific cities. They operate at a higher level of abstraction. They maintain the framework, and within that framework, other gods, more personal gods, can act and interact with humans. But the Anunnaki remain above and apart, ensuring that the framework itself continues to exist. Imagine a vast temple complex in ancient Sumer. The air is thick with heat, and the smell of incense and the sound of distant chanting. Workers move through the courtyards carrying offerings, maintaining the sacred spaces, performing the endless rituals that keep the gods pleased and the city protected. In the innermost sanctuary there might be a statue of Inanna or Enlil, a figure you can see and imagine and direct your prayers toward. But somewhere deeper, conceptually deeper, there is the acknowledgement of the Anunnaki, not represented by any statue, not invoked in personal prayer, but present nonetheless as the authority that makes all of this possible. as the divine order that gives meaning to the temple itself, to the city, to the cosmos. The priests would have understood this distinction. They would have known that different gods require different forms of worship and acknowledgement. Personal gods receive personal devotion. But institutional gods, gods of structure and order, are acknowledged through the maintenance of structure itself, through the proper performance of ritual, through the continuation of tradition, through the preservation of cosmic law in earthly practice. The Anunnaki do not need individual altars because the entire system is their altar. The entire civilization is their offering. This helps explain why the Anunnaki appear so often in contexts of judgment and fate. These are the moments when structure asserts itself over chaos, when cosmic order imposes itself on individual circumstance. When Inanna descends to the underworld and faces judgment, she is facing the Anunnaki not as individual deities who might be reasoned with, but as the embodiment of the law that governs even gods. She has violated cosmic order by entering the underworld clothed in power and life. The Anunnaki represent the principle that such violations must be addressed, that order must be restored, that the rules apply even to the most powerful beings. Their judgment is impersonal precisely because it is institutional. It is not about what they personally think of Inanna, or whether they like or dislike her. It is about what the law requires, and the law requires that one cannot pass between worlds without consequence, that power has its limits, that even divine beings must submit to the structure of reality. The Anunnaki do not make this decision. They embody it. They are the articulation of cosmic necessity. This conception of divinity is rare in mythology, but it is not unique. Other cultures have developed concepts of divine order that transcend personality. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at comes close, though Ma'at is often personified as a goddess. The Hindu concept of Dharma functions similarly, as a cosmic law that exists beyond the personal will of any deity. The Chinese concept of Tian, particularly in its more abstract formulations, represents a kind of impersonal cosmic authority, but the Anunnaki are particularly pure in their institutional abstraction. They resist personification more thoroughly than most comparable concepts. They remain stubbornly collective, stubbornly impersonal, stubbornly structural. Why did later mythology move away from this conception? Why did gods become more personal, more narrative, more individually defined? Part of the answer lies in the nature of storytelling itself. Stories require characters. They require motivation and conflict and resolution. Pure structure is difficult to dramatize. You cannot tell an exciting story about institutional maintenance. You can tell exciting stories about gods who love and fight and die and are reborn. And as Mesopotamian culture became more sophisticated, as its literary traditions developed, the demand for narrative grew stronger. Personal gods make better stories than institutional ones, but there may be deeper reasons as well. As societies grow more complex, as individual identity becomes more important, as personal choice and personal destiny become central concerns, the divine begins to reflect this shift. People want gods who see them as individuals, who care about their specific circumstances, who might intervene in their particular lives. Institutional gods cannot provide this. They maintain the structure, but they do not notice the individuals within it. And so, personal gods rise to prominence while institutional gods recede into the background, still acknowledged, but no longer central. Yet the institutional gods do not disappear. They cannot disappear because the need for cosmic order does not disappear. Even in religious systems dominated by personal deities, there remains somewhere the acknowledgement of law, of structure, of the framework that makes everything else possible. The Anunnaki persist in later Mesopotamian thought, not because their stories are compelling, but because their function is necessary. They are invoked whenever the fundamental order of reality needs to be affirmed. They are named whenever cosmic law must be acknowledged. They remain because structure remains. We might think of them as the deep code of reality in Sumerian thought. Personal gods are the interface, the aspects of divinity that humans can interact with directly. But beneath that interface, running the whole system, are the Anunnaki. You do not interact with the code, you interact through the interface it provides, but the code determines what is possible, what is allowed, what will continue. And if the code fails, if the institutional authority collapses, then nothing else can function either. The entire system crashes. This metaphor helps us understand why the Anunnaki are supreme, despite their lack of individual presence. They are supreme the way fundamental laws are supreme, not because they are more powerful in a direct sense, but because nothing can exist or function without them. Enlil might be described as the most powerful god in some texts, but Enlil operates within the order that the Anunnaki maintain. Inanna might be the most passionate and involved goddess, but her passions unfold within the cosmic structure the Anunnaki decree. Personal gods are immanent, institutional gods are transcendent in a different way. They transcend not by being higher, but by being deeper, by being foundational. When humans die in Sumerian thought, their fate is often described as being judged by the Anunnaki. But this judgment is not personal. It is not about whether the individual was good or bad in a moral sense. It is about their proper place in the cosmic order. The dead belong in the underworld. That is their place. The Anunnaki ensure that this order is maintained. They ensure that the living and the dead remain properly separated, that the boundaries between worlds hold, that each realm contains what it should contain, and nothing more. This is not cruelty. It is not punishment. It is simply the maintenance of structure. The dead are not being judged for their sins. They are being placed where they belong according to the law of the cosmos. And this placement, this decree, comes from the Anunnaki not as a decision they make, but as an expression of what must be. The living live, the dead descend, the order holds, and the Anunnaki are the divine presence that ensures this continues to be true. There is something almost mathematical about this conception of divinity. The Anunnaki are like cosmic constants, like the fundamental values that make the equations of reality work. You do not pray to a constant. You do not try to change it. You acknowledge it as the condition of all other operations, and perhaps this is why the Sumerians, who invented writing and mathematics and complex administration, who were deeply concerned with measurement and record-keeping, and the precise organization of resources, would conceive of their supreme divine authority in institutional rather than personal terms. The modern imagination struggles with this because we have been taught to expect gods who care about us personally. We have been shaped by religious traditions where personal relationship with divinity is central, where prayer is conversation, where sacrifice is gift-giving intended to please a divine person. But the Anunnaki predate this framework. They come from a time when divinity could still be conceived impersonally, when the sacred could be structural rather than relational, and in returning to these earliest texts, we encounter a form of religious thought that is alien to us in profound ways. It is easy to misunderstand this as cold or empty, to see the lack of personal gods as a lack of spirituality itself. But this would be a mistake. The reverence the Sumerians felt for cosmic order, for the structures that made life possible, for the continuity of seasons and rivers and harvests was deep and genuine. Their acknowledgement of the Anunnaki as the maintainers of this order was an acknowledgement of something sacred and necessary. It was simply sacred in a different mode than we are accustomed to recognizing. Consider what it means to live in a world where order is always fragile, where chaos threatens constantly, where the work of maintaining structure is never finished. In such a world, the divine forces that ensure structure continues are not distant or irrelevant. They are the most important forces of all. They are what stands between existence and dissolution. The Anunnaki do not need to intervene dramatically, because their constant maintenance of order is itself the miracle. The real wonder is not that gods occasionally do extraordinary things, but that ordinary things continue to happen at all, that the sun rises, that the rivers flow, that the cosmic structure holds. This perspective inverts our usual understanding of divine power. We think of power as the ability to act, to change things, to intervene. But there is another kind of power, the power of maintenance, the power of ensuring continuity. This is the power of the foundations, of frameworks, of the structures that make all other action possible. And it is this power that the Anunnaki embody. Not the power to do extraordinary things within the world, but the power to ensure the world itself continues to be. When Sumerian scribes wrote about the Anunnaki, they were writing about something they experienced as real and necessary. They were not creating characters for stories. They were acknowledging the forces that made their civilization possible. Every irrigation canal, every grain stored against famine, every legal code that resolved disputes, every ritual that marked the passage of time was a participation in the order the Anunnaki maintained. And in acknowledging the Anunnaki, they were acknowledging their own dependence on structure, their own existence as part of a larger cosmic pattern. This is perhaps why the texts do not describe the Anunnaki's faces or tell their personal stories, because to do so would be to reduce them to something smaller than they are. To give them faces would be to make them imaginable, and making them imaginable would be to suggest they are something that can be grasped by the human mind. But cosmic order cannot be fully grasped. It can only be acknowledged and participated in. The Anunnaki remain faceless because their function transcends representation. They remain silent because their decree is the condition of all speech, the framework within which all utterance becomes possible. In the quiet hours of the night, in the silence of ancient temples, priests would have invoked these names: Anunnaki, the great gods, the ones who decree fate, not expecting answers in the way one might expect an answer from a personal deity, but affirming the order, declaring allegiance to structure itself, acknowledging that beneath all the personal dramas of gods and humans, beneath all the stories and prayers and sacrifices, there is this foundational reality. There is law, there is order, there is the structure that holds everything in place. And perhaps this is what modern readers find most difficult about the Anunnaki. We want our gods to see us, to know us, to care about our individual struggles and triumphs. But the Anunnaki do not see us individually because they operate at a scale where individuals disappear into pattern. They maintain the structure within which individual lives unfold, but they do not follow those individual lives with personal interest. This is not because they are cruel or indifferent in a moral sense. It is because their function is structural rather than relational. They are the framework, not the participants. Yet there is a kind of comfort in this too, if we can learn to see it. Because if the divine authority that maintains cosmic order is impersonal, then it cannot be offended by personal failing. It cannot be pleased or angered by individual action. It simply is. And this means that the fundamental structure of reality is stable in a way that personal divine will cannot be. The Anunnaki will not suddenly decide to change the rules or withdraw their favour. They will continue to maintain order because that is what they are. Their constancy is absolute because they are not persons who might change their minds. They are structure itself. The modern myths about the Anunnaki, the elaborate stories of alien visitors and genetic manipulation and hidden knowledge, are appealing precisely because they give us what the ancient texts withhold. They give us characters, they give us motivations, they give us a narrative we can follow and debate and elaborate. But in doing so, they replace the strange and difficult truth of the ancient conception with something more familiar and less challenging. They replace institutional abstraction with personal agency. They replace cosmic order with individual actors, and in this replacement, something important is lost. What is lost is the acknowledgement that divinity can be impersonal and still be sacred. That structure can be holy, that the forces that maintain order are worthy of reverence even if they do not love us or know our names. The ancient Sumerians understood this. They carved it into clay tablets in wedge-shaped marks that have survived for millennia. They preserved the names of the Anunnaki not in colourful myths but in sober acknowledgements of their authority. They did not need the Anunnaki to be characters in stories because they needed them to be something more fundamental than characters. They needed them to be the ground of reality itself. When we read these texts today, when we encounter the Anunnaki in their original context, we have a choice. We can impose our expectations on them, forcing them into the mould of personal deities with individual stories, or we can let them be what they were meant to be. We can sit with the strangeness of impersonal divinity. We can consider what it means for a civilization to place its highest divine authority not in personal gods but in institutional order. We can respect the vision of the ancient scribes who understood that some sacred things are not meant to be imagined, only acknowledged. The texts reveal the Anunnaki as an institution, because that is what they were. Not individuals with faces and voices and personal desires, not characters who might be painted or carved or dramatized, but a collective authority, a system of order, a divine institution that maintained the structure of reality and decreed the fate of all things within it. This conception is difficult for us because we live in an age that privileges personality and individual identity above all else. We want our gods to be people because we understand people. But the Anunnaki ask us to understand something else, something harder and stranger and perhaps more true. They ask us to understand that order itself can be divine, that structure can be sacred, that the frameworks that make existence possible are worthy of the deepest reverence. Even if they do not return our gaze, The Anunnaki do not see us because they are not looking. They are maintaining. They are decreeing. They are holding the cosmos together through the sheer constancy of their institutional presence. And in this maintenance, in this endless decreeing, in this absolute commitment to order, they embody a form of divinity that our personal, relational, individualistic age has almost forgotten. But it is still there in the texts, still carved in clay, still waiting for those who have patience to read carefully and listen to what the ancient scribes actually said rather than what we wish they had said. The Anunnaki remain what they always were, not individuals, not characters, but an institution, a system, a divine order that transcends personality because its function is too fundamental to be reduced to personal terms. Perhaps the greatest service these texts perform for us now is to remind us that there are other ways to think about the sacred, that divinity is not exhausted by personality, that the forces worthy of reverence include not just beings who might care about us, but structures that make all caring possible, that beneath the personal dramas of mythology, beneath the gods who love and fight and die, there is something deeper and more constant. There is order, there is structure, there is the institutional authority that maintains the framework of existence itself. And tonight, as the world grows quiet, as the noise of day fades into darkness, we remember them. Not as individuals who might hear this remembering and be pleased by it, but as what they were, as what they remain in the deep structure of reality, as the Anunnaki, the great gods, the ones who decree fate, the institution of divine order, not faces in the sky looking down on us, not voices in myth speaking to us, but the structure beneath everything, the order that holds, the framework that makes all else possible. They were never meant to be imagined. They were never meant to be painted or carved or personified. They were meant to be acknowledged, to be accepted as the condition of existence, to be recognized as the foundation upon which all other divine activity unfolds. And in this recognition, the ancient Sumerians achieved something remarkable. They created a conception of supreme divine authority that was not about power in the ordinary sense, not about the ability to command and destroy and create, but about the deeper power of maintenance, the power of ensuring that what is continues to be, the power of cosmic structure itself. In the silence of ancient temples, in the quiet hours before dawn, in the moments between words carved into clay, the Anunnaki were present, not as beings who might appear if summoned, but as the order that made the temple possible, that gave meaning to the dawn, that allowed words to be carved and preserved. They were the structure, and they remain the structure, not in any literal sense, not as forces we might actually encounter, but as a vision of what divinity can be when it transcends personality, when it becomes pure function, pure order, pure institutional authority. This is what the texts reveal when we read them without imposing modern expectations, when we notice what they do not say as much as what they do say, when we honour the silence around the Anunnaki as meaningful, rather than as a gap to be filled. The absence of personal detail is the point. The lack of individual stories is the message. The Anunnaki were an institution, not individuals, and in understanding this we touch something ancient and strange and profound about how humans once conceived of the sacred. The world changes, civilizations rise and fall, languages are forgotten and deciphered and forgotten again. But structure endures in a different way. The idea endures. The conception of divinity as institutional rather than personal remains available to us in these texts, waiting to challenge our assumptions, waiting to remind us that there are other ways to think about the sacred, that the gods who maintain order without seeking glory or worship or personal recognition are perhaps the most important gods of all, not because they are more powerful in any dramatic sense, but because they represent the truth that order itself, structure itself, the framework that makes everything else possible, is worthy of reverence. And so we return to where we began. To the question of what the Anunnaki were, the texts suggest they were not individuals, not characters in stories, not gods with personal desires and motivations, but an institution, a collective authority, a system of divine order that maintained cosmic structure through the sheer constancy of its presence. They decreed fate not because they chose to, but because decree was their nature. They judged not because they cared about individual cases, but because judgment was their function. They maintained order not as an act of will, but as an expression of what they fundamentally were. This is difficult wisdom. It offers no comfort of personal divine attention. It promises no intervention in individual suffering. It does not suggest that the universe cares about us in any personal sense, but it offers something else. It offers the assurance that beneath all chaos, all change, all uncertainty, there is structure, there is order, there is a framework that holds, and that framework, impersonal though it may be, is the condition of all existence. Everything we do, everything we are, everything we might become unfolds within the order the Anunnaki maintained. Not because they chose to maintain it for us, but because maintenance of order is what they were. The night deepens, the silence grows, and in that silence we can almost hear what the ancient Sumerians heard. Not the voices of individual gods speaking personal messages, but something deeper, the quiet hum of cosmic structure, the almost inaudible sound of order, maintaining itself, the deep stability of frameworks that do not change because change is not in their nature. The Anunnaki were never individuals because divinity, at its deepest level, transcends individuality. It becomes structure itself, law itself, order itself, and in that order, however cold and impersonal it may seem, we find the foundation of everything else. Perhaps this is the final wisdom the texts offer, that the most profound forms of divinity are not the ones that reflect us back to ourselves, that validate our importance, that assure us of personal attention from cosmic forces, but the ones that remind us of our place within structures vastly larger and older than we are, that humble us not through judgment but through sheer scale, that ask us to accept that we are part of something that does not center us, that does not need us individually, but that makes our existence possible nonetheless. The Anunnaki offer this wisdom. They stand as a reminder that divinity can be institutional, that the sacred can be structural, that cosmic order itself deserves reverence even if it has no face to see us, or voice to speak our names. The silence around the Anunnaki is not empty. It is full of meaning we must learn to read. When we encounter ancient texts that refuse to give us what we expect, that withhold the personal details and dramatic narratives we crave, our first instinct is often to assume something has been lost. We imagine that there must have been stories, that time has simply erased them, that if we could dig deeper or find more tablets we would discover the missing myths. But what if nothing is missing? What if the silence itself is the message? Consider how deliberately the Sumerian scribes worked. These were not careless recorders, they were trained professionals, members of an educated elite who spent years learning the complex cuneiform script. They chose what to preserve and what to omit. They decided which stories deserved clay and which could be forgotten. And in all their careful work, across centuries of literary production, they consistently presented the Anunnaki in the same way, as a collective, as a council, as judges without individual identity. This consistency across time and across different cities suggests intentionality. It suggests that the impersonal, institutional quality of the Anunnaki was precisely what the scribes wanted to convey. We must resist the temptation to assume that ancient people thought less complexly than we do, that they simply had not yet developed the sophisticated mythology of individual gods that would come later. The Sumerians were capable of great sophistication in their thought. They invented writing. They developed complex mathematics. They built cities of tens of thousands of people with intricate administrative systems. They were not intellectually primitive. And their conception of the Anunnaki as institutional rather than individual was not a failure of imagination. It was a deliberate theological choice that reflected their understanding of how cosmic order functions. Think about what it means to live in the very first cities, to be among the first humans in history, organizing themselves into urban societies of unprecedented scale. The challenges were immense. Thousands of people living in close proximity, all needing food and water and shelter, resources that had to be managed collectively, labor that had to be coordinated, disputes that had to be resolved. The social structures that made this possible were themselves new inventions, fragile experiments in collective organization. And in this context, the idea that the cosmos itself was organized according to institutional principles would have made profound sense. The Anunnaki represented cosmic bureaucracy, not bureaucracy in the modern pejorative sense as red tape and inefficiency, but bureaucracy in its original meaning, the rule of offices rather than individuals, a system where authority derives from position within a structure rather than from personal charisma or power. In a bureaucracy, individuals come and go, but the offices remain. The structure persists regardless of who occupies it at any given moment. And this is precisely how the Anunnaki function in Sumerian thought. They are not individual gods who happen to work together, they are offices of divine authority, positions within cosmic structure, functions rather than persons. This helps explain another curious feature of how the Anunnaki are presented. When they appear in texts, they are often associated with specific numbers. 7 Anunnaki, 50 Anunnaki. The number varies, but the emphasis on number itself is consistent. And numbers, of course, are impersonal. They represent quantity without quality. They suggest a completeness that derives from mathematical wholeness rather than from individual excellence. 7 is not 7 unique personalities. It is 7 positions within a structure, 7 offices that together comprise a complete council. The number matters because the structure matters. The specific identities of who fills those positions does not. Contrast this with how other Sumerian gods are presented. When Inanna appears, she is unmistakably herself. Her personality permeates every text in which she features. She is passionate, dangerous, sexual, violent, complex. No number is needed to define her because her identity is singular and unique. Enki is clever, transgressive, helpful to humans, working often at cross purposes with other gods. His character remains consistent across texts. These are individuals. They have traits that distinguish them from all other gods. But the Anunnaki have no such distinguishing traits. They have only their function, their number, their collective role. We might think of them as variables in an equation rather than constants. In mathematics, constants have fixed values. The number pi is always pi, but variables are positions waiting to be filled. X can be anything that fulfills the requirements of the equation, and the Anunnaki function as variables in the cosmic equation. They are positions of authority that must be filled for the equation to work, for reality to function properly, but who or what fills those positions is less important than the fact that they are filled. The structure requires 7 judges, 7 positions in the council, 7 decrees to establish fate, and so there are 7 Anunnaki. Not 7 individuals with 7 different personalities, but 7 offices within the institution of cosmic order. This mathematical, structural quality extends to how the Anunnaki relate to fate itself. The Sumerian word for fate, namtar, literally means that which is cut, or that which is decreed. It suggests something fixed, determined, separated from the flow of possibility and made definite. And the Anunnaki are described as those who fix fates, or decree destinies. They are the ones who take the undefined potential of what might be and transform it into the concrete reality of what will be. This is not a process of choice in the way we usually understand choice. It is more like a process of definition, of bringing order to chaos, of imposing structure on possibility. Think of it like a potter working with clay. The clay has potential. It could become many different things, but once the potter shapes it and fires it, its form becomes fixed. It is now a bowl and not a cup, a plate and not a jug. The potential has been resolved into actuality. The Anunnaki perform this function for reality itself. They take the infinite possibility of what might exist and decree what will exist. They fix fate not by choosing between equally valid options, but by establishing what must be according to cosmic law. Their decrees are not arbitrary. They are expressions of the fundamental order that reality requires to be coherent and stable. This is why the Anunnaki appear so often in liminal moments, in threshold situations where the structure of reality is at stake. When Inanna descends to the underworld, she crosses a boundary that should not be crossed. She enters the realm of the dead while still alive, still clothed in divine power. This is a violation of cosmic order. The living and the dead must remain separate. The realms must not mix. And so the Anunnaki appear not to punish Inanna personally, but to restore order, to reassert the boundary, to decree that she must be stripped of her power and transformed into a corpse, because that is what cosmic law requires. A living being cannot exist in the realm of death. The structure does not permit it. The judgment is impersonal, because the law is impersonal. The Anunnaki are not angry at Inanna. They are not jealous of her or threatened by her. They simply enforce the structure. They restore the order she has disrupted, and in this enforcement, they reveal their true nature. They are not persons who make decisions based on personal considerations. They are the articulation of cosmic law itself. When they speak, it is the structure speaking. When they judge, it is order asserting itself. When they decree fate, they are simply making explicit what was always implicit in the nature of reality. There is something inexorable about this conception of divine authority, something that removes agency and choice from the equation in a way that can feel suffocating to modern sensibilities. We value freedom. We value the possibility of change. We want to believe that outcomes are not predetermined, that our choices matter, that the future is genuinely open. But the Anunnaki represent a different worldview, one in which fate is real and binding, one in which cosmic order determines outcome, one in which the structure of reality constrains what can happen in ways that cannot be negotiated or changed. Yet perhaps this determinism was not experienced as oppressive by the ancient Sumerians. Perhaps it was experienced as stability, as reliability, as the assurance that despite all the chaos and uncertainty of daily life, there was an underlying order that could be depended upon. The seasons would continue to cycle, the stars would continue their courses, the fundamental patterns of existence would remain intact, and this reliability, guaranteed by the institutional authority of the Anunnaki, made life possible, made planning possible, made civilization possible. Consider what it means to plant crops. You place seeds in the ground in the faith that the seasons will continue, that rain will come, that the sun will shine, that the patterns you have observed in the past will repeat in the future. Without this faith in cosmic order, agriculture becomes impossible. You cannot plan for harvest if you cannot trust that summer will follow spring. The Anunnaki, as the maintainers of cosmic structure, were the divine guarantee that these patterns would continue, that order would persist, that fate would unfold as decreed. This is not a guarantee of personal happiness or individual success. The Anunnaki do not promise that your crops will thrive or that you will live a long life. They promise only that the structure will hold, that the cosmos will continue to function according to its inherent laws. Within that structure, individuals succeed or fail, live or die, find joy or suffer. But the structure itself remains constant, and for a civilization learning to depend on long-term planning, on the coordination of labor across seasons, on the storage of surplus against future need, this constancy was everything. The impersonality of the Anunnaki thus becomes not a weakness, but a strength. Personal gods can be fickle. They can change their minds, they can play favorites, they can be influenced by prayer or sacrifice or clever argument. But the Anunnaki cannot be swayed because they are not persons who might be swayed. They are structure itself, and structure, by its nature, is impartial. It applies equally to all. It does not favor the powerful over the weak, the pious over the skeptical, the Sumerian over the foreign. The laws of cosmic order govern all things equally and without exception. This absolute impartiality might seem cold, but it is also profoundly just. In a world where human authority is often corrupt, where the powerful exploit the weak, where justice is frequently denied, the existence of a cosmic order that treats all beings equally has real moral weight. The Anunnaki do not take bribes. They cannot be intimidated. They do not fear consequences. They simply maintain the structure according to its inherent logic. And in this maintenance, there is a kind of justice that transcends human corruption. We see this principle reflected in Sumerian law codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the oldest legal codes in existence, establishes penalties for various crimes based on the nature of the crime itself rather than on the status of the parties involved. This is revolutionary. In a world where justice often depended on social rank, where the rich could literally get away with murder while the poor were executed for theft, the idea that law should apply equally to all was transformative. And this idea, we might argue, reflects the influence of the Anunnaki as a model of divine authority. If the gods who maintain cosmic order do so impartially, then human law should aspire to the same impartiality. The institutional nature of the Anunnaki thus has profound implications for how humans organize their own societies. If divine authority is institutional rather than personal, if it operates through structure rather than through individual will, then human authority should be organized in the same way. Kings and priests come and go, but the office remains. The law persists regardless of who enforces it. The structure of society takes precedence over the individuals who occupy positions within it. This is the foundation of institutional thinking, of the rule of law as opposed to the rule of men, and we see its roots in the Sumerian conception of the Anunnaki. But there is also something tragic in this worldview. something that acknowledges the limits of human agency in the face of cosmic necessity. The Anunnaki decree fate, and their decrees cannot be appealed. When disaster strikes, when floods destroy cities, when crops fail and people starve, when plague sweeps through populations, there is no personal God to petition for mercy. There is only the structure continuing as it must. The order that maintains life also permits death. The laws that govern existence do not exempt anyone from suffering. And the Anunnaki, as the embodiment of these laws, can offer no comfort. They can only maintain the structure that allows both joy and suffering to exist within it. This tragic dimension is perhaps most visible in texts dealing with death and the afterlife. The Sumerian underworld is not a place of punishment or reward. It is simply where the dead go, all of them, regardless of how they lived. The great and the insignificant, the good and the wicked, all descend to the same dark realm where they exist as shadows, drinking dust, dwelling in silence. There is no justice here in the sense of moral accounting. There is only the structure of reality asserting itself. The living belong above, the dead belong below. And the Anunnaki maintain this separation as part of the cosmic order they decree. This vision of death is bleak by almost any standard. It offers no hope of reward for virtue, no promise of reunion with loved ones, no transcendence or transformation, just the cold fact of mortality and its consequences. Yet perhaps this bleakness is itself a form of honesty. Perhaps the Sumerians, in refusing to soften the reality of death with comforting myths, were acknowledging something true about the nature of existence. That order is neutral, that structure does not care about human hopes or fears, that the cosmos continues whether we are ready for it to or not. The Anunnaki in this context become almost like the personification of reality itself. Not reality as we might wish it to be, but reality as it actually is. Impersonal, orderly, indifferent to individual desires, continuing according to laws that apply universally and without exception. And in acknowledging the Anunnaki, the Sumerians were acknowledging this reality. They were accepting their place within a cosmos that did not center them, that did not exist for their benefit, that would continue long after they were gone. This acceptance required a kind of courage. It would be easier to believe in personal gods who care about us, who listen to our prayers, who might intervene on our behalf. It would be more comforting to imagine that the universe has a personal relationship with us, that our struggles matter cosmically, that someone is watching and caring. But the Anunnaki offer no such comfort. They offer only the cold assurance. The order exists and will continue, that the structure holds, that reality operates according to laws that do not depend on our approval or understanding. Yet even in this bleakness, there is a kind of dignity, because if the cosmos is structured impersonally, then our worth does not depend on divine favour. We are not diminished by the absence of personal divine attention. We simply are, existing within the structure like everything else. Our lives have the meaning we create for them, the significance we generate through our relationships and actions and choices. The Anunnaki do not validate us, but they also do not invalidate us. They simply maintain the framework within which we exist, and within that framework we are free to find our own meaning. This might be the deepest wisdom the institutional Anunnaki offer. That meaning does not have to come from outside ourselves, that we do not need cosmic validation to matter, that the absence of personal divine attention is not a tragedy, but simply a fact, one that leaves us free to construct our own significance. The Anunnaki maintain the structure, but they do not tell us what to do within it. They decree fate in the cosmic sense, establishing the fundamental patterns of reality. But within those patterns there is room for human choice, human creativity, human love and loss and struggle. The texts reveal this tension between cosmic determinism and human agency. Fate is real and binding in the Sumerian worldview. The Anunnaki have decreed the fundamental structure of reality, and that structure cannot be changed. But within that structure, there is variation, there is contingency. There is the unpredictable flow of individual lives. The structure determines that humans will die, but it does not determine when or how. It establishes that labor is necessary, but it does not prescribe exactly what form that labor will take. It creates the boundaries within which existence unfolds, but it leaves the details to be worked out by the beings who live within those boundaries. This is a sophisticated theological position. It avoids the extremes of absolute determinism, in which human choice is meaningless an absolute freedom in which there is no stable structure to reality. Instead, it proposes a middle way. Structure and order exist at the cosmic level, maintained by the institutional authority of the Anunnaki. But within that structure, there is room for the contingent, the particular, the individual. The framework holds, but what happens within the framework is not entirely predetermined. Perhaps this is why the Anunnaki must be institutional rather than personal. Personal gods might interfere with human agency. They might impose their will on individual situations. They might play favourites or make exceptions. But institutional gods maintain only the structure. They ensure that the framework continues to exist and function properly. But they do not micromanage what happens within it. They decree the laws of reality but do not dictate every outcome. They establish the patterns but allow variation within those patterns. This conception of divine authority makes room for human dignity in a way that more interventionist theologies sometimes struggle with. If gods are constantly intervening in human affairs, constantly directing outcomes, constantly watching and judging every action, then human autonomy becomes questionable. Are we truly choosing, or are we simply puppets dancing on divine strings? But if the gods maintain only the structure and leave the particulars to work themselves out, then our choices are genuinely ours. We are not puppets, but participants. Not passive recipients of divine will, but active agents within a structured cosmos. The Anunnaki thus enable human freedom precisely through their impersonality. By not caring about individual outcomes, by not interfering in particular situations, by maintaining only the framework and not the details, they leave room for humans to be fully human, to make choices, to bear consequences, to create meaning, to love and hate and struggle and achieve. The cosmic order they maintain makes all of this possible, but it does not determine its specific form. And in this space between cosmic structure and human particularity, civilization becomes possible. Think of a game with rules. The rules establish what is possible, what moves can be made, what outcomes can occur. Without rules, there is no game, only chaos. But the rules do not determine who will win. They do not prescribe every move. They create the framework within which play occurs, but the play itself emerges from the choices of the players. The Anunnaki are like the rules of the cosmic game. They establish what is possible. They maintain the framework, but they do not play the game. That is left to the beings who exist within the structure they maintain. This metaphor helps explain why the Anunnaki can be both supreme and absent. They are supreme, because without them, there would be no game at all. No reality, no order, no stable patterns, just chaos. But they are absent from the play itself because their function is structural rather than participatory. They do not take sides. They do not favour one outcome over another. They simply ensure that the rules continue to apply, that the framework holds, that the game can continue to be played. And perhaps this is why later mythologies moved away from this conception. Because games are not always satisfying. Sometimes we want more than rules. We want a referee who will intervene on our behalf. We want a coach who will guide us. We want a spectator who will care whether we win or lose. We want personal attention, even if that attention comes with constraints on our freedom. And so personal gods become more prominent. Gods who do care about individual outcomes, who do intervene, who do watch and judge and assist. The institutional Anunnaki recede into the background still, acknowledged but no longer central, because they cannot provide the personal relationship that humans increasingly crave. But in that earlier stratum of Sumerian thought, before personal gods dominated the mythology, the Anunnaki represented a different possibility, a conception of divinity that prioritized order over relationship, structure over personality, cosmic law over individual intervention. And in this conception, there is a kind of austere beauty, a recognition that the universe does not owe us personal attention, that the existence of order is itself a gift, even if that order does not care about us individually, that the framework that makes our lives possible is worthy of reverence, even if it offers no comfort in our suffering. The texts preserve this vision not because it is easy or comforting, but because it is true to a particular understanding of reality, an understanding that sees the cosmos as fundamentally ordered, but that order as fundamentally impersonal, that acknowledges human finitude and mortality without promising transcendence, that accepts the limits of what we can know and control without despairing at those limits, This is a mature, sophisticated religious vision, one that does not need cosmic validation to find meaning in existence, one that can face the indifference of the universe without losing the ability to create significance through human action and human community. And so the Anunnaki remain, in these ancient texts, as a testament to this vision. They are not individuals because individuality would diminish what they represent. They have no faces because faces would make them too small. They tell no stories because their function transcends narrative. They simply are, maintaining the structure, decreeing fate, ensuring that the cosmic order continues, not for us, not against us, but as the necessary condition of existence itself. And in acknowledging them, in understanding what they represent, we touch something essential about what the ancient Sumerians understood, about order and chaos, about structure and agency, about the cosmos and our place within it. The night is very deep now, the silence almost complete, and in that silence, we can feel the weight of this ancient wisdom, the recognition that beneath everything, holding everything in place, there is order, not warm, not comforting, not personal, but real and necessary and worthy of acknowledgement. The Anunnaki as they were meant to be understood, not aliens from the sky, not genetic engineers, not characters in elaborate conspiracy theories, but something stranger and truer, an institution, a system, a collective authority that maintained the structure of reality through the sheer constancy of its institutional presence. They were never individuals, they were never meant to be, and in accepting this, in letting them be what the texts say they were rather than forcing them into modern narratives, we honour the vision of the scribes who preserved their names. We listen to what they tried to tell us about order and structure and cosmic law, and we carry forward, in our own way, their acknowledgement that some sacred things are not meant to be imagined or personified, or made comfortable. Some sacred things are meant to remain abstract, distant, institutional, because that is what they are, and that is enough. Where are you now at this late hour? What are you thinking about as these ancient voices speak across the millennia? The Anunnaki do not hear these questions. They do not listen to our wondering or our doubts, but the structure holds, the order continues, and in that continuation, in that persistence of cosmic law across the vast expanse of time, we find what the Sumerians found, not comfort, not personal attention, but the cold assurance that reality has structure, that existence has order, that the framework that makes everything possible continues to function exactly as it must. And that is all we ever needed. That is all they ever promised. The maintenance of order, the decreeing of fate, the persistence of structure. Nothing more, nothing less. Just the Anunnaki, eternal and impersonal and necessary, holding the cosmos together through the power of institutional authority. And that will be enough until the last tablet crumbles to dust and the last memory fades into darkness.